Welcome to morning 2 of the CADTH Symposium. I'd encourage you to take your seats, sit down, get yourself settled in. I wasn't going to do it, but this is going to be the most engaging session of the conference. No groans, that's not too bad. My name's Stuart Peacock. I'm the academic representative on the board of directors of CADTH and DeCoteau. I work in BC at the BC Cancer Agency and also at Simon Fraser. Chris McCabe yesterday said his job was to sit here and look interested. I got an email last night, you'll be aware there's an election in BC. As a BC government employee, my job is not to take any public speaking engagements. So we didn't really think this through, did we? So if you think you saw Stuart Peacock from the BC Cancer Agency, you did not. Today I am from Simon Fraser and Simon Fraser alone. Okay, I think I can say pretty much what I want after that. We have a fantastic panel here this morning. Their bios are in the books. This is a fireside chat. I figured it's actually more like a brunch, except you guys get brunch and the guys on stage don't get anything, which is a bit mean. So Brian, can we sort that out for next year, please? We have MJ DeCoteau here, founder and executive director of Rethink Breast Cancer Canada, Rethink Breast Cancer. We have Marcia Anderson, who's head of the section of First Nations, Métis and Inuit Health at the Max Rady College of Medicine, University of Manitoba. Pamela Fralick, president of Innovative Medicines Canada, and Janet Knox, president and CEO of the Nova Scotia Health Authority. And we're here today to talk about the challenges of engagement. Engagement throughout the health system, not just in HTA, I think as well. We're going to go wider than that. And we have four very broad sets of stakeholders in the room and multiple stakeholders in this room. The format is the same as yesterday. Please find on your tables some paperwork that you can fill in questions. Please be very engaged. When you've filled it, wave it. Susan, Peter, and others will come around and collect it and bring it up on the stage. And my job is to synthesize the questions and direct them to our panels. What we're going to do now is we're going to spend a few minutes with each of our panelists to open up the discussion and the debate. Then I'll open it up to the floor. And then I'll give our panelists the opportunity to sum up towards the end of the session. So I'm delighted, as always, with CADTH. We go first with our representative from the patient community and the advocacy community. MJ, your organization works with young women dealing with breast cancer in particular. Can you tell us how you engage these women within your organization to better the lives of those affected by cancer?
I attended yesterday. A group of representatives from patient groups had a chance to meet with CAPCA and give some feedback on meaningful engagement. And I wish I had just recorded it because, yeah, it was a great discussion. And really the takeaway was strong engagement is getting input and feedback before decisions are made. And as a small but very entrepreneurial, busy charity, we sometimes get our timing a bit off too, but I think our best work, whether it's on the education side, the support side, engaging our women in advocacy issues, the best work comes from engagement really early in the whole process. So what we do is we build community for young women with breast cancer. It's through that community that we are able to identify gaps in care and in services. And then we really try to inspire our community to work with us and together to create the solutions. And I would say it's been over 15 years of learning from patients. The learning still continues, and they just have a lot to say, and they always surprise us, but we love it. Our challenge is really engaging our young women in the issues that are being discussed here at this symposium. It's our metastatic women that are really engaged in issues around drug approval and access. The challenge is that those women are the most ill. So we work very, very closely with young women with metastatic breast cancer, and then they pass away. So building continuity is difficult. Just at the end of March, we held a workshop for our metastatic women and really wanted to look at values and patient values in anticipation of the types of things that we're here discussing. And there were some women who we really wanted to be there, and they're napping 2 or 3 times a day right now. Like it's just not possible. And we had a number of women who we've worked so closely with for a couple of years, and they've passed away. We lost a number of amazing advocates this year. So the working with our young women, it can be heartbreaking. But when you work so closely with them, building the community and the resources and the campaigns, their involvement and that meaningful engagement is their legacy too. So it does kind of ease some of the heartbreak. Yesterday's panel talked about the need to engage the broader public in the issues, and we couldn't agree more. We think the issues our metastatic women are facing should be everyone's issues. Everyone needs to get involved to find solutions. So whether it's not just the women with early breast cancer, who for the most part, I always say, you don't know what you don't know. So even if you've been diagnosed with breast cancer, you get your diagnosis, you find out what treatment you're gonna be having, you put your head down, you try to get through it, you look to Rethink and other organizations for support and finding that new normal afterwards. And for all intents and purposes, you move on. You don't necessarily worry about or are concerned about, is the new innovative drug that's available in the States or somewhere in Europe, did I need that? You're just kind of going through it. And let alone our broader audience. We're unique in that we serve patients, but we also have a whole group of young people, millennials, that are engaged in our events and in our education programs. And really, it's wonderful that the Peacock process is so transparent. It's all up there on the website. How can our job is going to be, taking that information and trying to make it engaging and bold and relevant for our young audience so that they can understand the issues and understand that there are some challenges right now in healthcare. And, it's going to be a challenge, but we're up for it. You may see a whole bunch of BuzzFeed type videos out there from Rethink because, again, I agree with yesterday's panel. It's so important to engage broader society in these conversations.
Marcia, we're in a very different time now. We're in an era of reconciliation. In such an exciting time for, I think, all of us, how do we do engagement better? How do we engage within the Indigenous community and within all of Canada with the Indigenous community?
Yeah, thank you for that. So I would first like to acknowledge and thank CADTH for inviting me to participate on the panel today and yesterday, because I think for people who haven't done a lot of work in Indigenous health or done a lot of engagement with Indigenous communities, this is a really safe and accessible first step to bring it into an arena for your consideration and to begin thinking about it for people who haven't. So the first step of that, answering that question for me, is to really talk about what reconciliation is, and in a 2-minute version, not the. You could all, of course, go to the TRC website and read the reports. So in December of 2016, Senator Murray Sinclair made a Facebook post that really captured my attention. And I've been doing some reconciliation planning both for the Winnipeg Regional Health Authority and for the Rady Faculty of Health Sciences at the University of Manitoba. So I've had a lot of time to think about it. But his post basically said, reconciliation will never be achieved as long as one side believes it's the recognition of rights and the other side believes it's an act of benevolence. And I would say I see those two sides represented very often without people understanding their position or why they're on different pages. So in a rights-based framework, we would be considering Indigenous rights, like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which the TRC calls the framework for reconciliation, and which Canada has committed to fully adopting and implementing. And within that includes the individual and collective right of Indigenous peoples to be self-determining, to have free, prior, and informed consent, to participate in decision-making about matters that impact them, and to participate in development of health programs and to run health programs through their own institutions as much as is possible and is desirable. So those are some key highlights of what a rights-based approach would entail. On the other side, the benevolent approach, if we look at the definition of benevolence, is kind of kindly and well-intentioned. This I would consider the people who maybe want to dabble a bit, who want to feel good about doing something in Indigenous health, but without a structural, resourced, organizational commitment to actually have that meaningful engagement. And so in a benevolent approach to engagement with Indigenous communities often would be what I would sometimes refer to as the checkbox approach. Check, we've done it. The topics are dictated by the more powerful or often more resourced organization. The location of engagement is dictated by the organization. The mechanisms for how the process goes is dictated by the organization. And quite often, there's no accountability loop or ongoing relationship after, a single type engagement event. I would highly caution against that. A rights-based approach to reconciliation and engagement would be much more about a long-term relationship. And you might hear communities or Indigenous organizations talk about a nation-to-nation relationship. So that respect for the self-determination of that community or collective, which could be defined as the power of that community to both define its dreams and have the resources and ability to achieve those dreams with the partners that they would choose. A rights-based approach to engagement and to reconciliation would certainly be looking at having the right people around the table. So I'll give you one example. In Manitoba, there is a provincial cardiac care network, and they, with good intentions, wanted to include some Indigenous representation on that cardiac care network. Everybody on that network is either like a hospital administrator or a clinician. And for Indigenous engagement, they wanted to put an elder on the community, or on the committee. Now, on the one hand, you say, okay, that's great, you want to include that. On the other hand, in a room full of 20 clinicians and administrators, what is a lay person of any background, how comfortable are they going to be able to speak at all, much less to speak to really complex clinical issues? So when that question came to me as the medical lead for Indigenous health programs, I said, well, I happen to be an Indigenous person with a large background in Indigenous health, and I practice cardiology. So let's just say thank you for the invitation, but instead of the elder, I'll join your committee, right? So it's defining who the right stakeholder and appropriate representation is. Certainly, it's around negotiating and agreeing on what the priorities for the engagement is. There can be a lot of mismatch in where organizations are at compared to where communities are at. So finding the shared priorities. To negotiate the processes and the locations is really important, and those can change over time. One really important part of engagement with Indigenous communities is that all knowledge is put on the table. So we do want you to bring your best Western scientific evidence-based knowledge, guidelines, et cetera. We also want to equally value the community's knowledge, whether that's traditional knowledge or experience of the context or past negative experiences. All that knowledge gets put on the table. And then ultimately it is the Indigenous communities that have the power to decide which knowledge is most valid and relevant for them in their decision-making around matters affecting them. The relationship has to be ongoing, and there needs to be accountability. So if we commit to something, then we follow through, and of course at our next contact, we're talking about how it went and planning our next steps together. So it does certainly take a lot more time, and there has to be much more check-ins about how it's going. Now, in terms of the meaningfulness of it, I would parallel it kind of to the notion of cultural safety, which some of you may be familiar with. Cultural safety is a term described initially by some of our Maori colleagues, a Maori nurse from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and really has to do with healthcare providers understanding their positions of power and privilege in society, and also how that translates and is reflected in the healthcare relationship, and actively seeking through self-reflection to neutralize that power imbalance in the provider-patient relationship, such that the Indigenous person's cultural identity is strengthened and maintained and is certainly not demeaned or disempowered. And really importantly, an interaction is defined as culturally safe by the individual, not by the provider. I can't go in and say, okay, I just did an excellent job, that was a very culturally safe interaction. No, it's the individual who gets to decide if it was a culturally safe interaction for them. In the same way, it is the Indigenous community or partner that you're engaging with that gets to define if it was meaningful engagement or not. You don't get to say that you consulted them if they feel like their voices weren't heard, that the decisions were already made, and it was a photo op more than anything else. So just to keep in mind that meaningful is defined by the other party.
Thank you very much. Pamela, now you're still fairly new to your new role with Innovative Medicines Canada. What do you envision for the future, for the role of industry in building meaningful engagement?
Well, thank you, Stuart. And yes, I have just over my 100 days under my belt. No reference to anyone else who also is reaching that milestone on Saturday, perhaps. If I might, Stuart, I thought just to add a couple of comments of my background. I noticed the bio that we provided really didn't include too much, and it is probably quite pivotal to the comments I'll make about my new organization. So Innovative Medicines Canada, for those of you who don't know, is previously known as RX&D. So it is the patented medicines companies of Canada. And as I say, I've been there just a couple of months now. But I do not come from the pharmaceutical industry or this industry. I come from health. My previous position was national CEO at the Canadian Cancer Society. Prior to that, CEO at the Canadian Healthcare Association, which is now merged with ACAO and is Healthcare Can and led by Bill Thole, who many of you know. Prior to that, CEO of Canadian Physiotherapy Association, Canadian Centre on Substance Abuse. I've also been very involved with CAMH, Centre for Addiction and Mental Health, chair of the board there and on the board for 10 years. I've worked twice at Health Canada and 10 years with the Canadian Forces in Europe. So I've had a privileged, diverse health sector background, but it doesn't really include this particular industry until recently. That being said, I would highlight that in most of my positions, in fact, every position, I've tried to create linkages, partnerships, engagement with industry. Recently at the Canadian Cancer Society, we entered into some extremely useful, meaningful partnerships with Merck, with Sanofi Pasteur. When I was with the Canadian Centre on Substance Abuse, we worked with the Brewers Association. It wasn't always a popular move, but I'm a strong believer that you can find common ground. You may not choose to work on policy and research issues together, but you can do other things. At CAMH, it was Eli Lilly, and on and on. So for me, it's been a basic part of my philosophy. I've also been involved in a number of collaboratives. You may be familiar with HEAL, the Health Action Lobby, which is a coalition of 30+ primarily health professional associations. The Canadian Coalition for Public Health in the 21st Century, the Health Charities Coalition of Canada. All of these require working together with diverse partners, but finding the common ground and the ability to move an agenda forward. So I'm a bit of an unknown commodity in this world, and I would say an unexpected choice to take on the role of president. In fact, one former colleague I hadn't seen in a few years let me know that the reaction to my appointment ranged somewhere from surprise to shock, although he said in a good way, which was a little reassuring. And I would like to think that for those of you in this room and people watching live streaming, that this is a real indication that the industry is looking at itself and wanting to do things differently. I do bring quite a different perspective to engagement and to business that you'll be seeing as we move forward. So my being here gives an opportunity to this organization, Innovative Medicines Canada, to refresh their relationships with stakeholders, look for new opportunities. I do believe that we've got a pretty good record in some of our stakeholder relationships, and I would say particularly with the patient groups that are so important to us. The pharmaceutical industry is involved in every step of the drug process. We're there at the beginning in terms of product development, clinical trials. We're there through regulatory processes and providing our input, and of course, delivery once the products are out on the market. And so, to not be fully engaged in any discussions and debates of issues of concern and with all of our stakeholders would really be a missed opportunity, I think, on behalf of the system. That being said, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that there is a reputational issue going on with this new industry that I've joined. And I would say that trust is at an all-time low. Not for everybody, but for many. And it's such an unfortunate thing. I have yet to meet anyone in my travels at any point in my life who can put up their hand and say, I've never benefited from a medicine, from a vaccine. And so the medicines, the vaccines, the products that this industry produces are so valuable to us. But I think that there's room for improvement in terms of our engagement with other players in this, the broader health system. We have a reputation that is perhaps seen as a bit arrogant and bullying at times, and certainly asking and demanding for things more than bringing solutions to the table. So that's what's going to change. I think in fairness to us in Canada, the reputation is not completely earned here. And I think folks in this room will know more than many audiences that when you have a story in the press that talks about a company raising the price of EpiPens by 600%, the general public does not distinguish between that happening in the US and in Canada, where it simply could not happen. But that's our little cross to bear. We're going to deal with it, and you'll see changes in us through our actions. So my vision, and the board of directors, the membership, they hired me with their eyes wide open. I believe that a changed tone is in order, that there's an openness to dialogue, and really to recreate a narrative with our stakeholders in a different way. Part of what inspires me about this new position, this new role, is the people that I have met in the industry that I'd not intersected with before. And we all understand it's a for-profit industry, and the bottom line does have to drive a lot of their actions. But there's not a single person I haven't met who doesn't have immense pride and passion in what they deliver to the health system, and they want to do more. They want to be part of the problem solving. So the future for me is all about seeing where this new narrative will tell us. We've been hard at work in the couple of months I've been there in identifying very concretely what are the things that this industry, this association can bring to our discussions moving forward that would be different. What are the gives, the offers, beyond the asks and the demands that we might be better known for? And so that's really the role that I hope to play going forward. Thank you.
So I'm going to turn now to Janet. And you're from the Nova Scotian Health Authority. You're the president and CEO. Can you tell us why stakeholder engagement is important to your organization?
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here today with all of you. So in Nova Scotia, we are a small province with lots of big problems. And those problems relate to the health of our people. We spend 41% of our resources, government resources, on health care. And we haven't changed the bar at all in the past decade in terms of overall health status. So in 2015, the government of the day made a decision that we would have one health authority, Nova Scotia Health Authority. And so we are charged to provide all health services in the province of Nova Scotia, except for those that are offered by the IWK Health Centre. So we needed real change. We needed real different outcomes for the population. And so we, in our initial beginning, said that our significant difference would be how we engage the people of the province in deciding together what we wanted for health of our population and how we were going to use our resources of the health system. And so in our organization, our first strategic plan, one of the pillars, the 3 pillars, was engaging Nova Scotians in creating a healthier tomorrow. And we've called our strategic plan Healthier Together. So we see public and stakeholder engagement as a key innovation in how we do our work. And we believe it can be the catalyst that creates the imperative for change in our organization, because together we need to have all Nova Scotians saying that our vision for healthy people, healthy communities is really our collective vision. Meaningful engagement, and I applaud what my colleagues have said here, and real conversations are essential to change. And we believe as an organization that when people are engaged in the why, the what, the how, the maybes of decisions, that they can become part of them. They can help own them, and they can help champion our common path forward. We understand that we need to build coalitions. We have to create opportunities for the people to be champions for change, because all of us know, I've been in the health system for my whole career, and change is really hard in the health system. And particularly if you change how services are provided or where they're provided. And so we really need to work together with people, so it's our change, it's our plan together. And I agree with my colleagues here who have said that individuals who are affected by a decision have a right to be involved in that decision. And health is a concern for all Canadians. And we are working hard in our organization to build a culture where engagement is embedded in our everyday work. It's how we are, it's how we understand our work, and it's how we set our priorities in all levels of our organization. And our goal then is to create a shared accountability for health. So for us, this means engaging the people we serve across our province, and in our case in the Maritimes for many of our services. And it means engaging the 40,000 people who come to work, learn, or volunteer in our organization so that they can develop skills to engage with the people we serve. And I was listening to my colleagues here. We should not assume that we know how to do that. We should not assume that we know how to truly be authentic and to really be in a situation where we are engaging to listen and to understand, and to really take the feedback and then to demonstrate how we have used that. And so we have put some effort into that. And it means engaging others who have, I said we're pursuing a different health outcome for our population in the long term. So a health organization is only one part of that solution. So we have to, I call it, get over ourselves and understand that we have to work with others in a way that we collectively can create a different environment and a different culture in our communities. And so that's engaging citizens, the communities themselves, community leaders, government, business, education, social services, chambers of commerce. And so it's all really about creating that, I call it a rolling, engaging conversation in our province about what do we want our environment to be. What is it like to live and grow a family there? Can we support health for all? So we're doing a variety of things. In our first year, we identified that engagement with Nova Scotians would be our strategic priority. We defined our philosophy, and as Marcia is saying, you have to be really clear about that and really understand what we mean, and it's not one-sided, and develop the framework for engagement so that when we go into a room with people, we can say, this is why we're here, and not have people thinking they're here for one reason and not for another. Be very transparent and upfront. And so we have a grid in terms of our engagement strategies, what we're trying to achieve, and we need to be upfront about that and explain it to people. So we launched a public engagement strategy called Talk About Health, and 10,000 people added their conversation to our work. It was absolutely mind-changing and very helpful to us. And we could talk more about that if you wanted. We also created a patient, family, and community advisory committee to provide advice on our policies, on our program planning, and our delivery of services. And we've expanded the role of the patient advisory groups in our quality teams. We focus, as I said, on building internal knowledge and capacity among our teams to enable them to meet this mandate and commitment for engagement. So that meant we had to do a lot of effort in terms of training and developing modules that are ongoing and available to people, and tools and resources to support the work. We're building engagement into our development of infrastructure. So some of you would have heard probably that our QE2 Health Sciences Center academic Health Sciences Center needs to be redeveloped. And so we've developed an engagement process to help to be informed by the people who are served there in what we need to do. And I'll give you an example of using this engagement process. In one of our rural communities, when we became Nova Scotia Health Authority, they had already a plan for a replacement of a hospital. When we looked at the replacement of the hospital, it was replacing the 1967 hospital. Wooden structure, all those, it needed to be replaced, but it was replacing it with exactly the same thing. And so we went in and said to them, let's talk about the population who is here, how it is changing, how it's changed over 10 years, how it might change in the next 10 to 20. And as Marcia said, we brought in the hard, cold data in terms of what we knew, and then we talked to them about the lived experience of that community. What's it like to be here? What are your hopes and dreams for that community? And over a period of 6 months, we have submitted to the government, and it's funded, a new plan for the facility that will be flexible and carry us into the future. It's not what the original plan was, and everybody is in agreement. The first time I went into that community, I met 219 people who wanted to stand up and tell me that you're just here to close our hospital and all the things that they think CEOs do. So I offer you that example to say you cannot be afraid to engage people. There is real information from the people we serve that will inform good decisions. So we see public engagement as a long-term improvement of our province's health status. We see it as a tool, an instrument to shape every aspect of our work. And we believe that by listening and learning together, we are creating a dynamic environment that will help us all prepare and create the future that's required so that in our province we have healthy people and healthy communities for generations. Thank you.
So one of the things I heard loud and clear throughout all the conversation there was a desire to understand what meaningful engagement means. So I would encourage the audience to think about questions around what does meaningful engagement mean. And I'm struck by the two-way or maybe three or four-way nature of what success in engagement might mean to the different parties involved. I can't resist saying something about our orange friend who lives down south, saying, who knew healthcare was so complex? And I've picked up on that in a couple of talks. Anyone who's ever interacted with the health system. And one of the reasons it's complex is because we have multiple stakeholders with multiple objectives, needs, desires, wants, all kinds of issues in there. And I guess with the engagement field, when we've done work in the area, you know, when you survey different types of engagement with whom, when, you find there are 80 different types and no one type is exactly the same. So we have the regulators, the HTA agency, we have the payers in the room here. I just wonder whether I could ask each one of you, out of this kind of morass of engagement that we can do and generally we think is a good thing to do, is there one particular area from your viewpoint where we might make some inroads really quickly, or we should be focusing? And we do some good things already, but is there an area that you think we should move on sooner rather than later in your field?
I think it would be, we love that we can bring the patient voice to the Peacock process, but just thinking about what you said about continuity and follow-up, we do feel like the patient voice drops off after that. So it would be wonderful if there was a formal mechanism for the patient voice to be considered as post the positive recommendation for an innovative medicine, that we can have an official voice in further discussions, if that's possible. I think that would be great.
So one thing that I think a lot of organizations could do very quickly is looking at their current mechanisms for engagement. So most health authorities have boards, for example, or local health involvement groups or whatever. So I would think, I would recommend for organizations to look at their current board structures and who is represented on them and who is not. So I'd see the most urgent need, or one of the first steps to take would be to really ask yourselves, who are we engaging with? And around our tables, at our board tables, whose voices are being heard and whose voices are not being heard through our current engagement processes, to have some honest reflection about where you're currently at.
Yeah, I'm not sure that my answer will meet your criterion of one stakeholder group and fast, but maybe. And from the pharmaceutical industry side, and our patients that we do hear from, and we hear from regularly, they want access to the best possible solutions to their problems. And I have yet to meet anyone, whether it's regulators in government and patient groups, the industry, that doesn't want to meet that, knowing still we have to balance safety and accountability and cost with that direct access. But given that everyone I've spoken to does feel that it takes too long in Canada, it seems to me there is a will to look at the components of that process and address that as quickly as possible.
So I always say that a health organization is an organization of people providing service to people. And so I think if we stay very focused on, we need to engage the people we serve. And in my organization, we support health, we provide illness care, we provide the whole continuum of service. And so we need to work really hard to make sure that at every point of interaction with the people we serve, we are engaging them in a way that's meaningful and relevant, and that description of meaningful and relevant comes from them. And so we're working really hard to say, wherever you meet the public, whether they are a patient, or they're somebody coming to our health promotion programs, or they're a mayor of a town that's very worried about the broad determinants of health in their town, that we have a process that we are listening to hear and listening to help. And so that's our approach.
Now, this is a question from one of our patient reps, which is fantastic. Again, to all the panel, and we've already touched on this in the opening remarks. And this person has said, the International Association for Public Participation Framework defines 5 levels of engagement. And it goes from one end to inform, consult, involve, collaborate, empower. And the question is, how do we move participation and engagement from this end of the spectrum to the higher levels where we're trying to empower people more? So I'd welcome any thoughts you had. Janet?
Well, I'll start. We actually use that framework for our engagement strategy. And so I would come back to what is it that we're hoping to achieve. And so at any engagement, we have a whole process that helps us look at what are we trying to achieve and what do we need to do to get there. And so I think that at some point in time, it truly is just to inform people about what we're thinking about. And at other times, it's really to empower people to be making decisions about their own health and their health care. And so it's not one or the other, it's what's the right approach at that point in time.
I think in my experience, a few things I would just highlight from what have been said already. I do agree with MJ. If you want to move from inform to empower, a really key part is being involved very early on, engaging early very early on. And in the experiences that I've had, either in direct engagement myself, or I also do some community-based program evaluations, so in programs that I've evaluated, that early engagement, it's good to have kind of a straw dog framework to help frame the conversation, but be really humble about it, like come in with a lot of humility and flexibility that you may have gotten it totally wrong. And so be willing to hear that feedback, agree on the shared goals for whatever you're in there for, and then be flexible in how you get there. Don't assume you're going to get it right on the first hop, so make sure that you agree to processes for how you're going to jointly evaluate or assess your progress towards that shared vision so that you can adjust your mechanisms along the way. But I think really the keys are early engagement, shared goal or vision for where you want the relationship or the engagement to go, decision-making authority to the community or member patients or advisory group that you're working with, and accountability, so reporting back on how things are going and hearing feedback from their perspectives also, and adjusting when needed.
This is another question for the entire panel, and this is an area where I've spent a bit of time thinking, and I know that there's relatively little in the scientific literature, but just maybe in your experiences, have you got examples of engaging communities or individuals or groups where you've tried to measure the success of what you've done or evaluate in any way? And maybe this is a question more for the health authority, maybe not, but understanding what makes good quality engagement and less good quality engagement. Have you had any experience in that?
I can speak about one project specifically because it is a project that I evaluated and specifically around the question of relationships too. So the program is called Manitou Ikwe Kagikwe, which means Spirit Woman Teachings in Anishinaabe. It is based out of Mount Carmel Clinic in Winnipeg, and it's a program that serves substance-using women who are pregnant or early parenting. Obviously, these women are very highly stigmatized in public and in healthcare also, and the impacts of that discrimination and stigma really impact things like access to prenatal care and many other issues also. So when we did the evaluation, they started very shortly after they had conceived this project by creating a women's advisory council, whom they did give decision-making authority to. And the Women's Advisory Council was made up of women from the inner city who had experience using substances and being pregnant or parenting. And so one of the key differences in this strategy was that experience then, rather than being something that stigmatized those women, was seen as valuable experience and knowledge to guide the program. And so there was respect for that experiential learning as opposed to judgment for previous substance use or current substance use, as the situation may be. Those women on the advisory council, we sat with over about 2 or 3 months to even just plan our evaluation. And the questions they really wanted us to answer were around if the program was actually living up to its goals or aspirations of implementing the program according to the 7 sacred teachings, which include things like respect and kindness and love and humility. And basically how that was being operationalized. So they used ceremonies and cultural protocols, teachings. They started a drum group. There was a number of very culture-based facets to the program. And essentially what they found, first of all, was that the Women's Advisory Council remained engaged and their participation was facilitated through things like honorariums, transportation, childcare, food. They had a high level of decision-making authority, like they described their experiences and situations in which they saw their direct input affecting the program operations. And the program basically did not have to take referrals from healthcare providers because word of mouth was spreading so much that it was a safe place for, in this case it's all Indigenous women, for Indigenous women who are using substances to be. And so we did a lot of qualitative work that documented and evaluated the engagement strategy and governance of the project, which is what the engagement form was, as highly valuable. And then in terms of some of the numbers stuff, you may have heard that from Winnipeg hospitals, one Indigenous child a day is apprehended. All of the women involved with the program have or have had kids in care. But within a couple of years, what they were seeing were half of these women, again, very highly stigmatized Indigenous women, substance involved, using harm reduction approaches. Half of them were going home from the hospital with their babies, whereas previously 100% of them would have had their babies apprehended direct from hospital. So really remarkable outcomes from probably one of the best examples of that high level of empowered decision-making public participation in a program that I've seen.
Fantastic.
We, in our operating plans, we set key performance indicators and metrics, but I will say, you know, as a smaller organization, budgets are an issue, and just sometimes that formal evaluation piece, when you're hiring an external consultant, can be very, very costly. So we tend to, as I said in my opening, just make almost an anecdotal note of the projects that seem to really blow things out of the water in terms of the key performance indicator side of things, are the ones where we've done a really good job on engaging our women throughout the process.
Thanks. Just a quick comment. I don't have an example of excellent evaluation to offer, and I'm suspecting behind the question is the acknowledgement that we don't do enough. The fact that we can cite examples and need to do that tells me that we probably don't pay enough attention to that particular area. And I think we probably focus more on outputs than outcomes. So we'll count the number of consultations we had, the number of people who were there, the number of conversations we had. That doesn't get to the essence of meaningful engagement, as you hear us speaking about, and I'm sure you all believe in. So from my perspective, I think we need to do a lot more work in that area. I would say in my new organization, we probably have done more sponsorship than partnership. That's something that is changing already as well, where to me it's the meaningfulness of a truly engaged partnership that is of value, not simply providing money to an organization, much as they might need it, and if we had unlimited funds we would do that, but we want it to be a two-way exchange.
So we have, I would agree that we have to really learn how to do excellent evaluation. So our process for all of our projects, we make sure that some approach to evaluation is built into it. So when we did our talk about health, to go out and talk to Nova Scotians about what do we need to do to create change in our health status, we did a follow-up survey with the participants and wanted to know from them, was this useful? Did they feel engaged? And so have the results where 90% of them said the conversation was really very helpful and they expected it would lead to different outcomes. What we also looked at was we were engaging with community leaders, and so we just follow what's happening in local communities and municipalities in terms of their creating a health strategy when they're making policy decisions. And so that was part of our evaluation. We're working with the Union of Nova Scotia Municipalities just to follow, is this starting to stimulate some change in other areas? It's hard to make a direct correlation, but it's part of our information. I will offer one example of an area that I worked in prior to when I was in Annapolis Valley Health as the CEO. There, excuse my voice, I spent last weekend with my grandchildren, and I'm not with them a lot, and this is love. We brought in, we had a whole community of engagement strategy about building a community health center with an advanced practice, nurses, and a collaborative care team. And we brought in a qualitative researcher to do interviews in the community, and the resulting report was called Renovating the House. And so I just want to offer you that because it's not hard, cold numbers, but it was the experience of going through the planning process and how people felt engaged and how they felt the outcomes were, and then what did they think was the result of their hard work in the end. It was very, very enlightening for us. So I would just offer, we're learning how to evaluate our processes. We are integrating scientists into our planning, and with the focus on how do we know what outcomes we will achieve, how do we know when we get there, and so it's a work in progress, but a very important question that you're asking.
Thank you. The next question I think is fantastic, actually. It's incredibly timely. And Ontario actually has quite a lot of experience in this area. So the question is, social media can be a powerful tool. Have you used this tool, and what have your experiences been? Perhaps MJ might be a good place.
We definitely use social media, and it's been really, really helpful to engage our young people. Everyone's on Twitter and Facebook, and we can reach them that way, but then we always have to dig deeper. So it's to try to draw them in and then, follow up. That leads to a link with a blog post and more information. It's been definitely successful in our advocating for access to Oncotype DX as an example. We've gone into various provinces, and Nova Scotia was the most recent one, where we've used social media to really highlight patient stories and patient challenges in terms of having to pay out of pocket for the Oncotype DX test, and really, stirred up a Twitter storm, and really calling out elected officials on Twitter, working with, highlighting media stories, and change happened, and the test has been approved and funded. It's so easy. No, just joking.
A little less so. Mainly the way that I've participated in using it in terms of engagement has to do with the use of a Facebook group for scheduling evaluation activities and stuff like that with the project that I referred to. Aside from that, I've not participated in a lot of engagement via social media.
Yeah, sort of an interesting question. We do use social media. You'll see a lot from Innovative Medicines Canada on Twitter, on LinkedIn, all of the various platforms. And I'm usually on Twitter at PC Fralick, if anyone wants to follow me. But we've made a very conscious, purposeful decision over the last few months to be much quieter in terms of all media. I referenced in my opening comments the issue we're dealing with around trust. And so my concern is that whatever we put out, people will look at and say, oh, well, that's big pharma. That's whatever their language is. Which is a real shame. And so we're examining this very, very closely. We want to move away from being reactive to all the bad stories that show up in the press. There are some fantastic, good stories coming out of this sector that are not getting airtime. And so that will be our focus going forward. You'll see a lot more from Innovative Medicines Canada, from myself personally, starting this week, actually starting right now, in terms of getting information out, new information, different information, and getting it out with a different tone in a different way than perhaps has happened in the past.
So I would say we too will use whatever is available to us. We need to get much more focused in using social media, but we have even with the talk about health, when we would have those sessions, we would be tweeting as they went along and encourage people to do that, because I believe that's how we got 9,000 people to enter our web page and really converse with us that way. We use Facebook as well. We had an engagement strategy with our physician leaders a couple of days ago, and they were encouraged to tweet to the other 2,500 who weren't there all day, which they did. So we really need to use whatever tool is available and is being used by the people we want to reach. So we have to get smart.
This is another one. This is quite an interesting question and something I think about a little. I think more about the general public, but many of my colleagues think about patient input and the role of the patient in the process. So we've talked a bit about stakeholder engagement and the patient and patient advocacy groups in essentially a little bit of a lobbying type of role. What type of role might patients play in the wider decision-making process? Those times when we have to make trade-offs between different types of conditions or different treatments, and make those tough value-based choices alongside the scientific evidence. Have you any experience of how patients might be more integrated into the decision-making process?
Well, patients are being more, as they become more and more educated, and patient groups are working to educate the patients they work with, there's an opportunity to participate up front in clinical trial design, which, you know, then can really help along the continuum of healthcare. We talked yesterday again at the CAPCA meeting, not to bring it up, but there seemed to be interest in, you know, perhaps a role for a patient group, educated patients to be a part of that process, and I think those are all really positive steps in the right direction.
In the context that I work in, which are primarily Indigenous health, our conversations are never around a specific drug or a test or trial. They are around access to primary care services, period. And that's true in the urban environment, and it's certainly true in rural and remote Manitoba also. So our engagements at that level are often with leadership, so chief and council, health directors are in the urban environment, urban Indigenous organizations like Aboriginal Youth Opportunities, who, you know, have won awards for their trying to reclaim and make the north end of Winnipeg a safer place to be. So one of the critical discussions that we've had, for example, has to do with the policy that First Nations communities that are not remote, so that are within a reasonable driving distance to a provincial health authority system, FNIB will not support primary care services in the community. We've worked very closely with Broken Head Ojibwe Nation, which is half an hour outside of Winnipeg, who is not being well served by the regional health authorities, to put our physicians from the Northern Medical Unit in that community. So in that, it was more the communities coming to us as their primary care physician provider of choice, and then going through quite complex negotiations with the regional health authority, provincial government, and federal government to try to develop a payment model that would make that doable. So for us, our engagements are around access to primary care, and they're around trying to negotiate and respect the community's provider of choice.
Two quick points I might make. One is I've been very internally focused my first few months, and I come from a patient-centered background, but that has now moved to a #1 priority for me. I'm trying to get together with Louise Binder. She's probably in the room here somewhere. We keep missing each other. If there's anyone else in the room that I should be speaking with wearing my new hat, I would love to engage in that. The second point I would like to make, though, is that I suspect I'm not the only one. I get very frustrated, much as I acknowledge and recognize and support the need for the patient voice. I think the other half of that equation is that most of us have been patients. We need to train ourselves to put that hat on, to put that lens on, and not only the official one that we're wearing at any given time. It's not the answer. It doesn't mean I would do that instead of having official patient voices at the table. But I do think we need to talk about that aspect of it more so than we have.
So I would say that, again, every interaction you want to make sure that the person has an opportunity to really be engaged and to really share their real experience with us. We have made some very formal approaches to making sure that the voice of the user of our system is in our decision making. So our patient, family, and community advisory group is a group of individuals who are diverse in background and culture and in communities from which they come. And we have spent a lot of time educating them about our approach for a population health approach to how we look at our services, and with implementation in local community. We did all that education and discussion with them first, and then we've asked them to come in and sit down with us and look at our health service planning process and look at how we see this moving along and help us understand, is this reasonable, relevant, what will be the impact that we might not have thought about. And they are very, very engaged and exceedingly helpful to us. And in all of our quality teams and our organization, there is the patient representatives there that we are helping people you need to help people understand what we're trying to do, and then invite them to be fully participant in that process. So those are just a couple of examples, but it's really, really important. The language, I come from I'm a pediatric nurse of old, and you know, family-centered, person-centered care was the whole world I grew up in. We can't forget that. In 2017, we need to make sure that everybody who works in the health system is person-centered, understands the connection to family, and understands how we really listen. So it's work that we're never done.
Can I add?
Sure. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I think it's important that the patient voice not just be heard, but be understood. And I think one of the big challenges is the need for a translator between, you know, we can do a workshop on patient values and have lay terms for describing what's important to our patients and what's meaningful to them and what's important to them and what they want out of their cancer experience and their treatment experience. And then with the formal systems, the language is very different. And so how is, if we're bringing this patient representation to the conversation, how is it then being recognized or integrated or acknowledged or understood in a very complicated formal system? Yeah.
Move on.
Actually, the next question I have is kind of related to that, because we've touched on complexity. And I'm struck by the complexity of the health system. And Ava Grunfeld, one of our colleagues, put up a diagram she calls a meta map of how you move through a health system. And it's an absolute mess. It's a shocking display. People ask me how decisions are made, and then they ask me who makes the decision. And I say, I think it's this person, but in certain circumstances, they have to talk to that person. And if it gets really ugly, it has to go all the way up to this board over here. I think, but I'm not really sure. In engaging with one of the most, if not the most complex industries on the planet, what role does transparency play? And maybe, if you're willing, and you can think of an example with the regulators, the payers, CADTH, HTA people in the room, is there a particular area where we're not doing very well on transparency at the moment that would improve engagement from your perspective?
Well, I think that you just nailed a big one of them, which is transparency around the value system and decision-making frameworks in the healthcare system. So I think it's a giant black box. I think from my own observations, there's a lot of unwritten processes and kind of covert language and stuff. It's not as it's certainly not as linear and evidence-based as we might like to think. And I think we've all seen circumstances where the ability of a certain patient group or lobby group to draw attention and have decisions made in their favor results in healthcare spending that does not necessarily have the population health impact that a different avenue of a less powerful group or of a group that's not as able to manipulate the system is able to achieve. So I think transparency and how to maneuver and impact decision making and how those decisions get made is probably one of the biggest areas.
For us, there's transparency at the Peacock level, and that's wonderful. And then we're left kind of just, you know, having conversations with industry partners if there's a new treatment that's been recommended and it doesn't seem to be getting negotiated at PCPA. We can talk to government and kind of try to get a handle on what the situation is, but it never feels like we know exactly why or what's going on. And so I know things, it's a business, not everything can be transparent, but that's a challenge for us.
So I think transparency is really important, and sometimes it's as simple as saying, I can't talk about that, and be honest about it. If there's something that we we are working on that we need more time. I think we need to just say that. That being said, I think there is a whole mystique about what happens and who makes decisions. And so every time we have an interaction with a community, we talk about our parameters for decision making. We have parameters for decision making, Nova Scotia Health Authority, and how they will be made. They are the dimensions of quality that we focus on with Accreditation Canada, with a population health lens, with local implementation. So when I'm in a community, I can say, we need to palliative care services. We need to look provincially and how we provide this support across our province, and look at equity and access and all of access and all of those kinds of things. And then finally, I would say it is going through the process with communities and their members. So the example I gave you about a small rural village, really, who needed to replace the facility, it was actually taking the time, and I would just say, and I had to create the environment where that could happen, because governments like things to happen quickly. And I said, we're trying to say we need to travel with communities and take the time to come to common decisions together that will last us in the long term. And in Nova Scotia, we have been supported in this community-based planning process. And it is starting to engender some trust. We have ways to go. And when you're sitting in my kind of position, you have to understand you have to earn it, you have to continue to earn it, and you have to demonstrate that you're worth it. And so it is about, so I think that transparency and honesty is absolutely job one, and how you go forward, people will evaluate you on that.
I guess, pardon me, my only observation in my early months is that there's a huge tension around transparency. It's a great question. There certainly doesn't seem to be a lot of trust amongst the various players in this, the drug, you mentioned regulatory, we have Health Canada approvals, we have CADTH, we have HTA, there's PCPA, and so it's an issue. I guess that's my observation. I don't have an actual solution right now, but having that a forthright discussion on what could and should be more transparent. I'm personally a real fan of more openness where we can, but I respect that there are some times where that is not the way that we can go. So better understanding what can we be more transparent and open on, what should we be, especially from that patient perspective who, we all should be looking at it through that lens, versus some things that for industry or competitive or policy reasons do need to be kept a little quieter. I think there's a room for a big debate on that point.
So thank you all. We now have an opportunity, we've had a fantastic discussion this morning, for each of you to share any final thoughts or comments you might have. And we're going to start at the far end with Janet and work back in again.
So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. And I would, just a couple of comments to say that public engagement for us is a signature difference in terms of how we move forward in our province, we believe. So we have to pay very much attention to the values that we have described for ourselves and be constantly evaluating ourselves against them. And our goal really is to have meaningful engagement with the people we serve, for them to describe it in a way that's relevant and satisfactory to them. And together we can make decisions that will create a different future for us. And so it is really important that as we engage with others, that we are constantly in that learning mode, that we're listening to learn and listening to hear how we can do things better. And what we are finding is as you open yourselves to hearing what communities really want, our common goals are pretty common actually. What we have is a whole history of how decisions were made locally that we need to talk about and learn, can we do things differently. So I believe that real, honest, open, transparent engagement is the way that we'll get to a better future.
Well, what do I say after that? I guess, in brief, this industry I now represent, I can say is very, very proud of what they do. I absolutely get that now. They're proud of the work they are doing now to come to tables with solutions and not just asks, and looking for opportunities, welcoming opportunities to share those perspectives, those ideas, those solutions that they think will better the system. It is all about the health of Canadians. It's a cliche, but it rings very, very true. For myself personally, I urge us all again to look at engagement from a patient perspective, from a very personal view. I will tell you that my trick is to think back to the one experience I've had. I'm lucky to have good health, but I found myself in a hospital and they wanted to take my socks from me. Well, I don't know why they wanted my socks, and I get cold easily, and so my entire goal for that day was to maintain my socks. Now, I woke up with my socks on. I don't know if they took them off at some point and put them back on. But that's my touchstone. That's me as a patient, and I do try to keep that in mind in every encounter that I have with any stakeholder and bring that lens to show. So, thank you.
So I just wanted to share a few thoughts on what you might do in terms of next steps were you to start considering doing some Indigenous engagement. And I hope you all will, because I think part of our responsibility in living in this land is that we share responsibility for ensuring that Indigenous peoples have access to equitable benefits of Canadian society, including equitable benefits from all of the innovative work that you all participate in. So some things you can do to prepare yourself for engagement. First of all, look at your own educational needs. BC, the Provincial Health Services Authority there developed what's called the SANYAS Online Cultural Safety Training. Manitoba and Ontario have both since adapted it to their circumstances. I do know that BC will accept registrations from anywhere in the country, and 80% of the content is not BC specific. So I would highly encourage you to look at doing that online cultural safety training as a primer. I would encourage you to engage in the Indigenous arts. Reading, my good friend Katarina Vermette won a Governor General's Award for her book, her poetry book, North End Love Songs, and her first novel was out last year. Richard Wagamise or other Indigenous artists, great way to explore those deeper levels of Indigenous experience, particularly for people who maybe haven't had those opportunities to have relationships. And then don't hire a Indigenous person in your organization. Look at hiring cohorts of Indigenous people. We have a depth of talented Indigenous health professionals and in other areas also. I think one of the really critical things to look for from a cohort of Indigenous employees are their relationships with diverse Indigenous communities. That is one of the biggest value adds they will bring to your organization. And that is the best way to build your engagement and relationships with Indigenous communities is through your Indigenous cohort of employees. I think you need to be mindful, and I do hold my organizations accountable for this too. When it is my relationships with the Indigenous community that we build institutional relationships around, I wear the organization's reputation myself. So that is perhaps some extra motivation to prepare yourself to engage in culturally safe and meaningful ways, because that puts a lot of stress on the Indigenous employee or leaders within your organizations who are helping to broker that relationship. So yes, arts, online cultural safety training, and look at your cohorts of Indigenous employees with their relationships to Indigenous communities as significant value add to your organizations.
I want my final thought to be around urgency. We're Rethink Breast Cancer, we move quick. We've just had a panel talking about meaningful stakeholder relations and how it's a process, and that's very, very important. We do feel the need to create more of a sense of urgency with both government and industry. I opened by talking about the incredible young women that we are losing, and I know it's the same for many other disease sites. It's happening everywhere, and I'm emboldened to hear Pamela say there's an appetite for solutions and working together, and we're just going to keep bringing it back to the patient voice and the patient need, and really want to turn up the volume on the pressure on both sides, government, industry, that we do need solutions and we need them to happen fast. We don't have time to wait. So yes, process and proper process is hugely important, but please, fast, urgent. Thank you.
So thank you for such a fantastic session. Please engage with our speakers later. Thank you.